Dr. Agnes Embleton, head of entomology at the Bradford Museum of Natural Science, had always had an infatuation with bugs. Even as a child, her desire to collect and study various insects from the garden was something her mother had always found rather unsettling. Creepy crawlies, her mother had called them. She would chastise young Agnes for keeping jars of crickets and pill bugs around the house, and for carrying spiders outside when the older woman tried to step on them. It simply wasn't natural, her mother told her. But young Agnes understood insects in a way that she never quite managed to understand people. Over the years, she had turned this fascination into a rather successful career. She had earned her doctorate and had been granted her own lab deep in the archives of the Bradford Museum. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it came with a fairly substantial grant with which to travel in search of new and fascinating species. Agnes had been all over the world. She had studied cave spiders in Madagascar, treehoppers in Brazil, and giant weta in New Zealand. And she was currently on the cusp of her proudest achievement, an all but unknown species of moth found deep within the rainforests of Borneo, somewhat sinisterly named the rigor mortis moth, due to the fact that the only evidence found of its existence were often deceased specimens. It was for this reason that very little was known of the moth. Agnes had been sent to Borneo to study the species, and had returned with the single greatest discovery of her career, a living specimen. It had been gifted to her, housed in a small glass jar, by a local monk. Though her grasp of the local language was limited, she had understood that it came with a warning, a single condition, that the recipient never remove the lid. The moth was far more exquisite than she could have ever imagined. It was a mesmerizing, opalescent white, with a very intriguing pattern of glimmering eyes on its wings. While eye markings were a rather common defense pattern among moths, Agnes marveled at how these seemed to almost follow her as she moved about the room. It was a truly fascinating species, and she would be the first to actually observe and study it. She sat at her desk in the archives of the now closed museum, foot tapping to her usual classic rock playlist, as she pondered what life would soon be like for her as one of the world's leading entomologists. The archives housed various labs and offices, all interconnected by a veritable maze of corridors. Agnes loved it down here, not just because it held her own beloved lab, but because it reminded her of some mystical fortress, with its vaulted wood-paneled walls, crown molding, and marble-tiled floors. It felt almost enchanting, like the elegant halls of a Gothic mansion. She had the building to herself tonight, and how she loved peaceful evenings alone in her lab. She had only just made it back to the States mere hours ago with her findings, but she simply could not wait another day to begin documenting this new insect. Despite the warning given to her, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving the moth in that tiny jar to slowly waste away and die. In fact, she had already prepared a small enclosure for her new specimen. It was an antique mahogany terrarium she had found in a dusty corner of the archives some time ago. She had cleaned it up, and had even scoured the museum grounds with her flashlight in search of some appropriate plants and flowers to place inside. She now stood over her completed project, beaming with pride. It looked like a tiny, ornate Victorian greenhouse. Perhaps a little impractical, but it was somehow fitting to house such an elegant and graceful insect.
This is it.
She leaned down to peer into the jar on her desk and smiled at the little moth.
Your new home.
She grasped the jar tightly and loosened the lid with a sharp twist. Gently tilting the mouth of the container into the open terrarium door, she removed the lid from the jar and allowed the moth to flutter into it, where it perched atop a twig, and adjusted its footing to watch her as she closed and sealed the glass-paneled door of its new prison. It gazed through the glass, as if taking in the framed bug collections lining the walls of Agnes's lab, and fluttered its wings anxiously. Agnes sank into her desk chair and rested her chin on her folded arms, gazing lovingly at her new pet.
Aren't you beautiful?
The moth shuddered a bit, flitting its wings. As it did so, Agnes noticed a small cloud of glimmering dust drift from its body, dissipating into the air.
Fascinating.
She leaned in, pressing her nose to the glass pane of the terrarium door, as she watched the small creature in wonder. She sucked in a deep breath, and nearly choked on the overpowering stench of rot wafting through the small terrarium vent. The strong smell made her eyes burn and water. She sneezed, and immediately reached for a tissue, blowing her nose. When she looked back to the terrarium, the moth seemed to be watching her almost intently. She wondered if the foul-smelling powder the moth had just released could be a possible defense mechanism to help ward off predators, and her heart fluttered at the opportunity to record her first observation of this new species. She rummaged frantically in a drawer for a pen with which to begin documenting the strange occurrence. Just as she began to scratch out a few notes to type into her laptop later, the lights went out, plunging the building into darkness. All of the equipment in the building hummed to a halt, until the music playing on Agnes's smartphone was the only sound to be heard.
Damn it.
She cried.
You've got to be kidding me.
Of all the times for a power outage. She sighed and pulled her flashlight out of her bottom drawer, flicking it on to illuminate a small circle of her bug collection on the far wall. The occasional blackout was not uncommon in this part of the city, and she had a box of LED camping lanterns around here somewhere for just this reason. She slid her chair away from her desk and made her way to the cabinets at the far end of the lab. A small headache began to form at the back of her skull as she did so. If only she could remember which cabinet she had stuffed the lanterns into. As she rummaged through the lab, she thought she heard a sound out in the hallway. She paused, listening intently. A voice, perhaps? Had someone returned for a forgotten item from their office? She peeked out of her lab, aiming her flashlight down the dark corridor.
Hello?
She called. A soft tapping sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere in the archives.
Hello?
She called again. She left her lab and took a few steps down the corridor. Surely it was just an employee she had overlooked, startled from their office by the power outage. But she could not shake the feeling of unease that was beginning to bloom in her chest. Another quick sound in the darkness startled her into almost dropping her flashlight. She felt her heart skip in her chest as she whirled the light around madly, sending shadows dancing through the hall. Had that been a muffled cry she'd just heard? Certainly it was just her imagination. As she rounded a corner, a soft crunch underfoot drew her attention downward. She raised her shoe.
Leaves.
The tile floor was littered with them. She lifted her gaze and was stunned to find that the walls were cloaked in vines and roots, from floor to ceiling, as if she were no longer in the winding corridors of the museum archives, but instead exploring the jungle ruins of some ancient civilization. She blinked, her mouth agape. How could this be? Was she dreaming? Upbeat music drifted down the hallway from her open office door in eerie discordance with what she was seeing. Beneath the music, she heard a soft tapping somewhere farther down the corridor. "Hello?" she mouthed silently into the darkness, scarcely aware of the fact that she had not actually spoken the word. Her pulse thundered wildly in her ears. and she had the distinct feeling that anything could sneak up behind her, and she would not even hear it over the pounding of her own heart. She spun frantically in the darkness and screamed as her flashlight fell momentarily upon a hunched silhouette as it darted around a corner up ahead. The beam of her flashlight pinned on the corner where the figure had disappeared. She pulled in her breath in short gasps as she desperately tried to hear over the sound of her pulse in her ears. As she watched, an eye peered around the corner, approximately 2 feet up from the floor. She could not see enough of the face to determine what she was looking at, but there were live specimens enclosed in multiple labs throughout the archives. Perhaps an animal had gotten out. Agnes raised the flashlight, hoping to illuminate whatever it was. As the light fell across the squirming shape, it seemed to shrink away. Whatever it was emitted a sharp clacking sound, like dry sticks being slapped together quickly. Agnes shivered as the noise intensified, echoing off the surrounding walls, shrill and piercing in the stillness of the empty archives. It had to be a loose specimen from one of the biology labs, but what on earth was it? She inched cautiously forward, her movement causing the creature to duck back out of sight. As she leaned around the corner, the shrill rattling ceased abruptly, and a pale shape launched itself at her with a frenzied shriek. She caught a glimpse of fangs and claws and scrambled back around the corner, taking off down the hallway. As she ran towards what should have been the stairway leading to the main entrance of the museum, the terrain became more and more unrecognizable. The familiar oak molding and marble floors gave way to dirt and stone, punctuated by the towering trunks and gnarled roots of massive trees, cloaked in vines. She could hear the footfall of the strange creature behind her as she ran blindly, slapping vines and cobwebs out of her way.
This can't be real. This can't be real.
She cried breathlessly to herself as she fled. Ahead, she saw a break in the trees, a clearing. Her panicked brain told her to run for it, so she did. She could tell that she had put some distance between herself and her pursuer, but she did not dare glance over her shoulder to see how much. She knew that without obstacles, she could gain speed. She simply had to make it to the clearing ahead. She broke through the tree line, and immediately her heart fell. It was not a clearing at all. It was a cliff. She skidded desperately to a halt at the edge of the yawning cavern. Panting heavily, she craned her neck to look over the edge. It was a sheer 100-foot drop into a raging river, pocked with rocks and debris.
Oh no. No.
She spun around. She could hear the creature tearing through the brush, rapidly catching up to her. This must be a dream. It had to be a dream. She glanced over the edge once more, at the rushing water far below. If this was a dream, there was only one way out. She had to startle herself awake, she rationalized. Through the tree line, she could see the dark shape of the creature barreling toward her, whipping the underbrush as it made a beeline for its prey.
Only one way out,
she told herself. And as the creature broke free of the bushes, she took in a deep breath and stepped back off the ledge. She felt her toes leave the edge, and in that instant of frozen weightlessness, she saw not a cliff amongst jungle, but the moonlit roof of the Bradford Museum of Natural Science. She managed only a small cry of surprise, the last sound that would escape her lips before the wind sucked the breath from her lungs as she plunged down into the darkness. Her body was discovered on the steps of the museum by a passerby the next morning, twisted and broken, her face still bearing the look of shock and bewilderment. The museum remained closed in the following days, pending the investigation, but in the end, it was determined to be a suicide. Those who knew her could not imagine why she would do such a thing. Such a bright young woman, they whispered amongst themselves as they read the news. She had such a promising future. What could have driven her to throw it all away? Deep within the archives of the museum, in Agnes Embleton's darkened office, the moth perched in its enclosure, peering out at the stacks of books and papers, and the rows of petrified insects pinned in lines behind glass upon the walls. It flitted its wings, releasing a fine glimmering silt into the air around it, and waited. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Links to all my shit are down in the description. I love you guys. I hope everyone's doing well. And let me know what you thought about this story. And, as always, be good to animals. Even people, so.
Ja, snämmar, bergsbes, hörs.
Oh no. No. Some high quality fucking acting for your ass, bitch. Dr. Agnes. Off to a great start. The second word.